It's basically one of these unexpected negative surprises of climate change. There are just more whales running into more of these vertical fishing lines, causing a big spike in entanglements. Pretty much every fisherman that I've ever talked to is a whale lover. Guys love being out there. They love being with the whales. I mean, it's a pretty emotional experience for some of these folks to actually go through and see their gear entangle on a whale, and they want to do everything they can to stop that. But of course, when that's hitting your bottom line, you can imagine there's a direct conflict. Really been a positive story that's brought together regulators, innovators, fishermen, and conservation groups like Oceana to come together to try to find a win-win solution.
Hello and welcome to the Ocean News podcast. I'm Eva Cahill, the editorial assistant here at Oceanographic, and this week we'll be unpicking the climate story behind and the solution to whale entanglements off the Californian coast. When we think of bycatch, the image is often of sharks, dolphins, and other sea life caught and discarded in huge trawler nets. But whales too often get caught up in the lines and net fishers lay out for other marine life. These whale entanglements are some of the most heartbreaking stories in ocean conservation, and they are also an increasingly urgent one. As climate change reshapes marine ecosystems, the very whale populations that fought back from the brink of extinction during the commercial whaling era are now facing a new and unexpected threat in the ropes and lines of the fishing industry they share the ocean with. But real hope can be found for both the fishing communities and the whale populations in a new technological solution. And for this week's Friday interview special, I'm joined by Dr Geoff Shester, California Program Director at Oceana, the largest international advocacy group dedicated solely to protecting the world's oceans. Dr. Shester is a Stanford-trained marine scientist based out of Monterey, California, and over his career, he has helped protect over 1 million square miles of seafloor habitat, led deep-sea expeditions to discover never-before-seen underwater worlds, and worked to reduce the accidental catch of species. Today, we're talking about one of the most promising breakthroughs in that last fight, ropeless crab fishing technology. A deceptive, simple innovation that could allow the crab fishing industry and whales to share the ocean safely. Dr. Shester has been central to bringing this solution to life, and it's one that's on the verge of real-world delivery. Can you give me a sense of what these whale entanglements are? How do they happen, and what are the consequences when a whale becomes entangled?
So whales, and as well as other animals like sea turtles as well, can unfortunately get entangled as they're swimming by basically vertical ropes or fishing lines that are attaching traps at the bottom on the seafloor to buoys at the surface. So that's kind of the traditional conventional way that many fisheries for lobster and crab and even many fish species are caught, is with traps, right? You put some bait in these traps at the bottom on the seafloor, and the fishermen know where the traps are because they can see their buoys at the surface, and they use those buoys and pull the lines up. So these vertical lines unfortunately create a gauntlet of entanglement risk, because what happens a lot of times is that the whales, when they encounter these, we don't know much about whether they see the lines or not, but typically their reaction when they do get some sort of feel like they're entangled in something is to start spinning around. Sometimes they'll even do this on purpose. We'll see whales going into the kelp. They kind of have fun in there. Kelp can easily break. They spin around, they get out of it, and they're fine. The problem is these ropes are meant to stand thousands of pounds of pressure. And so basically they try to spin out of it, and unfortunately they can get even further and further entangled. So it can get entangled in their mouth, around their flippers, around their flukes, their tail fin, and it kind of creates a knot or a ball and chain. And a lot of times the trap is light enough that they can still swim with it, dragging this long thing. But as you might imagine, it's really slowing them down. They ultimately, three out of every 4 whales, according to our federal government estimates, typically don't survive the entanglement. And that's due to a combination of either infection, sometimes the limbs or the fins can break off, and they can't get enough food and essentially do what they need to do. These are migratory animals that need to travel thousands of miles from their breeding grounds to their foraging grounds. And so these entanglements are ultimately deadly. And that's damaging not only for the individual whales, which of course die this horrific death over many months, But also for some of these recovering populations, the number of whale entanglements is actually at the point where it's impeding the recovery of some of these endangered populations. And that's the real concern at the population level for some of these animals that are trying to come back from those decades of hunting.
And so how widespread a problem is whale entanglements? And is this something that has been increasing over the last 20 years or so? How does it relate to climate change? What's sort of the pattern of the problem?
So we do know that this problem is a worldwide problem, right? The traps, like I was describing with the vertical lines, those are used throughout the world. It's a very common type of fishing practice. Whales are found throughout the world's oceans. And I think, many of us thought, when I first got into this issue about 12 years ago, that this was really a rare type of event, right? This is not something that's common, that's happening a lot. But there are estimates out there, including by the International Whaling Commission, that over 300,000 different marine mammals are entangled in fishing gear every year. So that does sort of emphasize the scale of the problem. Last year in the United States, the NOAA Fisheries, which is our federal government agency responsible for tracking whales and whale entanglements, confirmed 95 large whale entanglement cases around the United States. The state of California has ultimately the highest number of these. And I think that we would expect, based on some of the recovery of some of the populations, for those numbers to go up. But what we found is that the number is actually going up much greater of entanglements, much higher than the populations are recovering. And so there's something else going on. And I think one of the big breakthroughs that we learned about is that it's basically one of these unexpected negative surprises of climate change, right? No one really predicted it. When I think of climate change, I'm not thinking, oh, whales are going to get entangled more, right? Like, what's the connection? It turns out that, as I was talking about before, these whales are going after these forage species like the anchovies, right? And those fish actually do really well in the very cold, nutrient-rich waters that we have off the U.S. West Coast. So it's one of these areas that has a lot of upwelling. What that means is that deep water full of nutrients is coming up and being pulled by the wind and the ocean currents. And that basically just provides this amazing explosion of food. That's why the whales are coming here. And what's happening is that climate change is essentially compressing or shrinking this cold water habitat that's rich in their food source and pushing it further closer into shore. So rather than a large area to feed or their habitat, this habitat has been compressed into these very nearshore waters so that the whales are more concentrated, especially right in the areas, unluckily, where there is a lot of this fishing gear for species like Dungeness crabs, which are one of our biggest fisheries in California. This fishery happens from Southern California all the way up into waters off of Alaska. So it's a large area. There's basically this new science that was put out that basically is looking at using satellite data to detect this compression of the habitat, right, which is driven by climate change. People think about heat waves. We're actually in one now on land. Everything's really hot. There can be that on land. The ocean has these large heat waves as well. Oceanographers started talking about this as like a warm water blob, right? This massive blob of this warm water that's persistent off the coast. And you can imagine that warm water is pushing and shrinking the amount of the cold water, which is really where the whales like to be, because that's where their food is. And so it's essentially creating this higher co-occurrence. So what maybe generally is a pretty rare event is now, just because of statistics and that co-occurrence, there are just more whales running into more of these vertical fishing lines, causing a big spike in entanglements. And we saw that big spike really around 2014, when we had really this unprecedented large marine heat wave, this huge warm water blob, and no one really knew what was going to happen. And all of a sudden, all these whales are getting entangled, and basically it kind of created this crisis that has now resulted in some pretty substantial fishery closures and reduction in the amount of crabbing that can happen a much shorter season. Areas are being closed to try to prevent these entanglements, yet they're still happening at levels that are really above the legal limits, because the legal limits are set around recovering the populations. It is a really substantial conservation concern, and this whale entanglement issue is something that I think unexpectedly is now front and center in terms of concern. Obviously, people are coming. Tourists want to go see these whales. Whale watching boats are actually seeing entangled whales out there. And so you can imagine this has really just come to a head and created, I think, a pretty significant conflict across, whale lovers and conservationists and these fisheries that generally are pretty responsible, but are now, in harm's way of these whales.
Yeah, I'm interested in that sort of conflict. And I think, am I right? There's like a compression habitat index, which you can predict like a year in advance, where when those habitats will be restricted. And so we can put in seasonal fishing changes. And they're also recently changed the conventional traps, which were causing problems and entanglements with whales. So that seems like good news. What are the kind of tensions between the fishing industry and conservationists and even the tourist industry when it comes to dealing with whale entanglements? And where do those discussions often break down?
Yeah, so one of the things that I was able to be part of when we first started bringing this issue to our fishery managers, because we had heard about this originally from the disentanglement teams that are basically out there, sort of like the paramedics, the first responders, that they get the news of these entanglements and then they respond and try to disentangle the whales. And they are able every once in a while to disentangle whales successfully. Sometimes it's too late and sometimes it's not successful, but they were kind of raising this, and the state of California put together a fishing gear working group to try to figure out, is there something we can change as far as how we're managing this fishery so that we can have safe waters for our whales and have the fishery continue as well. What we basically started to see is that we're now paying much more closer attention to the migratory patterns of these whales and actually counting them with airplanes that are going overhead and trying to count in real time, like, okay, how many whales are in each of these fishing zones? If those numbers are over a certain level or trigger, then it automatically creates a need to do management actions. So that could be anything from a fleet advisory where fishermen are advised to be more careful, to reducing the number of traps in an area, to even full closures. And you can imagine when fishermen are out there trying to make a living, right? There's a lot of issues at play. They're trying to have businesses out there, and I think have done generally a pretty good job at the sustainability of the crab population, right? This fishery's been around for over 100 years. The crabs are still doing well. We're not seeing a problem there. But you can imagine when areas are closed, right? Especially when there's other fisheries that are closed. A lot of times fishermen have portfolios where they can go and fish crab for a little while, then they go fish salmon. There's other ground fish, there's different species that they can fish throughout the year. As those opportunities shrink down, we've also seen declines in salmon, right, which is normally a spring type of fishery that happens in May. And so that fishery has been closed again due to habitat loss, climate change related factors, other things as well. So the number of opportunities is really kind of shrinking, and we've seen big challenges, not just with the whales, but in terms of the number of fishermen that are out there that are actually able to make a profit. And so you can imagine anytime you're saying, well, you need to change your fishing gear or you need to stop fishing in these areas, right? Even if it is predicted that there's going to be a lot of whales, you can just imagine they're seeing that in real time as far as the ability to make payments on loans, on their boats, house payments, all that normal stuff that everyone's got to take care of, right? This is their basic source of income. And so I think pretty much every fisherman that I've ever talked to is a whale lover, right? These guys love being out there. They love being with the whales. They hate it when there's it's a pretty emotional experience for some of these folks to actually go through and see their gear entangle on a whale, and they want to do everything they can to stop that. But of course, when that's hitting your bottom line, you can imagine there's a direct conflict there. And I think one of the interesting things we've really seen and made good strides on is that there's sort of some fishermen that are like, well, I've been doing it the same way. I want to keep doing it the same way I've always done it. Let's just fight the regulation and maybe this issue will go away. versus then there's the fishermen are like, wait a minute, maybe we can utilize some new technology. Let's innovate. Maybe there are ways to get around this. But I do think now you mentioned this habitat compression index, right? So that's a way that we can use satellite data to detect 6 to 12 months in advance whether this habitat compression is going to occur, so we know when we're going to have higher risks of entanglements. There's a recent paper that was just put out where they went and looked at that. How well is this tool actually predicting things? And it basically shows that this early warning system is accurate. These forecasts are not just sort of hypothetical. It's not just a potential new tool, but this tool is really telling us when we're seeing these high risk events. And so what we basically have now is the fall months, where November and December, when the whales are still feeding and about to leave, we're tracking the whales. But unfortunately, we detected high risk in those months. These are the holidays. We have Thanksgiving and the Christmas and New Year's and many holidays where crabs are often the key centerpiece on the table, right? It's not just turkey, and in fact, it's a very cultural thing in California and the West Coast to have crab for the holidays, and we haven't really seen that because of the closures. And in the springtime as well, that's when the whales are coming back, typically around March or April. When we detect these whales, it's like, okay, we've got to close these areas. It's high risk. So luckily, the fishery has still been able to catch roughly the same total number of crabs in a shorter amount of time. But the season that used to go from November all the way into July is now shrinking to maybe a 3-month season, really not opening till after New Year's and then closing. We just now the California Department of Fish and Wildlife announced a closure at the end of March for the central California coast because we're already seeing whales and there's already risk of entanglement. So it's having an impact, but I do think that there is hope because of the innovation from some of these fishers.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question. On balance, how hopeful do you feel about the next 10, 20 years with this issue? Do you get the sense that there's enough forward-looking fishermen who want to find ways to innovate and make sure they can continue fishing and not hurt whales, or is there more pushback?
Yeah, so I think that essentially what we've learned is that even if we can do a better job at predicting risk and knowing when we should close areas, the fact that we're closing areas, right, it's inherently a conflict, right? So there's always a decision to be made. How do you balance those things, right? The fishery versus the safety of the whales. And so I think a number of folks, several years back, this started actually in 2018, were like, well, maybe there is some way that we could change the gear. So I mean, you can imagine all the different ideas talked about. Maybe you make the ropes weaker so the whales can break them, but the fishermen won't. Is there a way you can put pingers on these things to warn the whales to get out of the way? We kind of looked through all sorts of different things about how you set the thing. Maybe it's different colors, it's weighted, it's not weighted. And ultimately, what we did learn about, and we were kind of just like throwing spaghetti at the wall, what's going to stick? Let's just try everything and see. And we heard about this idea of ropeless fishing technology, right? Or it's often called on demand or pop-up. And originally the technology came from very top secret defense, Navy operations where some really valuable top secret thing is hidden down at the bottom of the ocean and they don't want anyone to find it, but they want to be able to get it back when they need it. And so this technology really evolved for extremely expensive things and has been around for about 40 years, where you can basically put some device down there at the bottom of the sea floor. There's no way to detect it, that it's there unless you're the owner of it. And then you can send basically an acoustic signal through the water column that then is detected by this technology. And then that releases the rope and buoy to come back up to the surface. So that basically was for very expensive, oceanographic equipment that's, millions of dollars, or some super top secret, spy equipment or whatever, some weapon it might be. So the question was, well, let's see if we can get these in the hands of fishermen and get their feedback, right? And I was surprised that basically the fishermen all said when we first showed it to them, Oceana was able to get this equipment in the hands of fishermen, try this out. And they all said, well, I think there's some promise here. I think I could eventually see this working, but but it's not ready yet. So we really kind of embarked on this whole idea of, well, let's see if we can tweak these systems. Let's work with manufacturers. Let's see if we can get some grants to test the gear. Can we bring the cost down so that this could be something that's more at the price point that fishermen can afford? Let's make sure it's reliable. A gazillion questions start coming up, even if the gear pops up reliably, right? It's like, well, how is everyone going to see this? Because normally everyone's used to buoys being at the surface. Now, if there's no buoys at the surface, how is enforcement going to see it and enforce the rules to know that you're not in a marine protected area fishing illegally? How are other fishermen going to avoid you? How do you even know where your own gear is? And so that really kind of introduced these challenges that kind of one after the other. It was like, all right, well, let's figure out how we can use smartphones and in tablets and do things in more real time. Let's use Starlink and ways to get through the through satellites and the internet, ways to what they call virtually mark where the gear is. So essentially, it's kind of like a virtual buoy that you can see on your phone or your tablet, and and then you can use these hydrophones and transducers that send the acoustic signal down, mount those on your boat. And so you can imagine this sort of started out pretty small, single trap at a time. They realized that if they string buoys at the seafloor together, attached by a ground line, you could basically have 20, even 50 traps down there that basically you could have one of these pop-up or ropeless units at either end. So you don't have to buy one for every single trap, and it can actually speed up the efficiency of the overall operation, and also avoid other things that are causing the loss of traps, right? So a lot of times you can imagine if a boat at nighttime is going over and runs over a buoy, it can entangle in the propeller, or the propeller will up and cut it. There's poaching, people can steal each other's stuff or cut each other's line. We know that stuff happens, and so there are these other benefits to reducing the loss of traps that are essentially created by this new technology. And so it was really, you can imagine there's a social component to this too, right? There's some fishermen that are like, don't try to figure out a way to make this work, because then they're going to impose it on everybody, and it's going to put a lot of us out of business if this stuff's too expensive or it's not ready yet. Versus those that are like, look, we're not seeing these closures going away. We don't want the future to be just smaller and smaller, shorter and shorter fishing seasons. We need to find a pathway for the future. And over the last 8 years, we've really been heavily involved in that, working with people all throughout the world working on this new technology. And we've gone from the R&D phase, research and development, to, all right, let's do this sort of experimental testing, to now let's scale that up and see our fishermen can actually do this, make money fishing at full scale. And that happened over the last 2 years. And based on meeting the criteria that the regulators had for making sure it's enforceable, making sure it's not going to get lost, making sure other people can see it with these apps, right? It basically met the criteria, and now the state of California just authorized the first of its kind spring fishery for Dungeness crab that's basically going to start as soon as the conventional gear season is closed at the end of this month, and basically allow for a spring fishery to return, not just for people that are doing testing, but for anyone in the fleet that wants to get this equipment. And because it's one of these things where you've got early adopters of a new technology, we're really working towards trying to get funding opportunities to help fishermen get into this, especially those that have small boats that are kind of on the margin, so they can have this opportunity. But it really is a win-win, where fishermen are basically now saying, look, we can even, regardless of the whale issue, right, we can get our fishery back, our spring season back that we haven't seen in years because of this entanglement issue. And ultimately, like, humans and whales can learn how to co-occur if we use this new technology. So it's really been a positive story that's brought together regulators, innovators, fishermen, and conservation groups like Oceana to come together to try to find a win-win solution.
It's not that often that a story comes across our news desk here at Oceanographic, which provides such a clear beacon of hope for climate action like this, where embracing new technologies can benefit both historic local fishing industries and the recovery of the ancient giants that have roamed our oceans for millennia. If you would like to listen to more interviews about exciting and hopeful stories like this, or you just want to keep up to date with the latest news from our blue planet, subscribe to the Ocean News podcast. This has been the Ocean News Podcast. I've been Eva Cahill. Thank you for listening.